I was standing in our kitchen, still wearing my anniversary dress, when I saw the engagement ring receipt in Marcus's jacket pocket. The same jacket he'd worn to dinner with me 3 hours earlier, where he'd apologized for being distant lately and promised things would get better. The receipt was dated yesterday, and it wasn't for me. I pulled out my phone and typed his girlfriend's name into Instagram, my hands completely steady even though my entire world was flipping upside down. There she was, holding up her left hand, showing off the exact ring from the receipt, with a caption that made my stomach drop. He said he's been planning this for months and just had to wait for the right moment to leave his roommate situation behind. I wasn't his girlfriend of 4 years. I was his roommate situation. My name is Zelina, and before everything fell apart, I thought I had built something real. Every morning at 6:30, I'd wake up in our shared apartment in downtown Portland, make coffee for two, and watch Marcus stumble out of the bedroom in his wrinkled work clothes. I worked as a data analyst for a mid-size marketing firm, the kind of job that paid well enough to split a decent apartment, but not enough to feel secure about the future. The office sat on the 15th floor of a glass building, and from my desk, I could see the river and the mountains beyond it. At night, I'd come home to Marcus already on the couch, usually playing some game on his laptop with his headset on. I'd cook dinner, set a plate next to him, and eat alone at our small dining table while he stayed absorbed in whatever virtual world felt more interesting than the real one we shared. This had been our routine for 2 years, and I told myself it was just a phase. People get comfortable. Relationships settle into patterns. But there was something I held onto from before Marcus, something that kept me grounded. I used to be a freelance graphic designer, back when I believed I could make art that mattered. I still kept my old portfolio in a leather case under our bed, filled with logos and websites I'd created for small businesses that actually cared about their work. Sometimes, late at night when Marcus was asleep, I'd pull it out and flip through those pages, remembering what it felt like to create something from nothing. If this story hits home, make sure you're subscribed. We tell these for a reason. The first crack appeared 6 months before I found that receipt. We were at his company's holiday party, one of those forced fun events in a rented hotel ballroom with a DJ who looked older than the music he was playing. I'd spent an hour getting ready, wore a new black dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and even did my makeup the way those YouTube tutorials showed. When we walked in, Marcus immediately spotted his coworkers and headed over without waiting for me. I followed, trying to look natural, but when I reached the group, something strange happened. Marcus introduced everyone to each other, but somehow skipped right over me. His manager Tom shook hands with the others, made small talk about weekend plans, and when his eyes landed on me, there was this awkward pause. Marcus finally said, "Oh, this is Zelina," like I was an afterthought he'd just remembered. Tom nodded politely and immediately turned back to continue his conversation with the others. The second moment happened 3 months later, in our apartment. I'd been working on a freelance project, designing a website for a local bakery, spread out at our dining table with my laptop, notebooks, and color swatches. It was the first creative work I'd taken on in over a year, and I was excited about it in a way I hadn't felt in forever. Marcus came home from work, glanced at my setup, and asked when I'd be done with all this stuff because he wanted to use the table for his new monitor setup. I explained that I was working, that this project could lead to more clients, maybe even a path back to doing design full-time. He listened with this expression I'd never seen before, not angry or dismissive, but something worse. Bored. Like I was telling him about a hobby that didn't matter. He said that was nice and went to the kitchen to make himself a sandwich, stepping around my papers like they were obstacles in his way. That night, I packed everything back into my portfolio case and slid it under the bed. I never mentioned the bakery project to him again, and when the client asked for revisions, I told them I couldn't continue due to scheduling conflicts. The night that changed everything started like any other anniversary. For years together, and I'd planned what I thought was a perfect evening. I made reservations at Canard, the French place downtown we'd talked about trying for months. I bought a new dress, deep green silk that made me feel confident and beautiful. I even left work early to get my hair done, something I hadn't done since my sister's wedding 2 years ago. Marcus picked me up at 6, and for the first hour, everything felt normal. We talked about work, made plans for a weekend trip to the coast, and he even complimented my dress. The restaurant was everything I'd hoped for, dimly lit with soft jazz playing in the background and servers who knew how to be present without hovering. Marcus seemed more attentive than he'd been in months, asking about my day and actually listening to my answers. But halfway through dinner, his phone buzzed. Once, then twice, then again. He glanced at it quickly, then put it face down on the table. Another buzz. He picked it up, frowned, and typed a quick response. When I asked if everything was okay, he said it was just work stuff, nothing urgent. But the phone kept buzzing, and each time he looked at it, his attention drifted further away from me and the conversation we were trying to have. By the time we got home, that familiar distance had settled back between us. He apologized for being distracted, said work had been stressful lately, and promised things would get better soon. He kissed me goodnight and went to brush his teeth while I hung up my dress in our closet. That's when I saw his jacket draped over the chair in our bedroom, the same jacket he'd worn to dinner. Something small and white was sticking out of the inside pocket. I told myself not to look, that it was probably just a business card or a receipt from lunch. But my hands moved anyway, and when I pulled out that folded piece of paper, the world shifted underneath me. Robin's Jewelry Store. 1 engagement ring, white gold, 1.2 carat solitaire. Purchased yesterday. Total, $8,400. I sat on our bed holding that receipt, and for the first time in months, everything made perfect sense. The distance, the distraction, the way he'd introduced me to his coworkers like I was just someone who happened to be there. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was the placeholder he needed while he figured out his real future with someone else. I should have been crying. I should have been angry or heartbroken or something dramatic that matched the moment. Instead, I felt empty, like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that used to be there. I walked to the bathroom where Marcus was finishing up and watched him brush his teeth in the mirror. He caught my eyes in the reflection and smiled around his toothbrush, the same smile he'd given me at dinner when he'd promised things would get better. I went to the living room and sat in the dark, listening to him get ready for bed. The apartment felt different now, like I was seeing it clearly for the first time. The couch where he spent every evening. The dining table he'd wanted me to clear for his monitor. The kitchen where I made coffee for 2 every morning while he acted like having someone take care of him was just the natural order of things. Somewhere in that darkness, I remembered something my grandmother told me when I was 12. She was teaching me how to make her famous apple pie, and I'd messed up the crust twice in a row. I was frustrated and ready to give up, but she put her weathered hands over mine and said, "Sometimes you have to let something fall apart completely before you can build it back the right way." I pulled my portfolio case out from under our bed and opened it on the dining table. The work inside looked different now, not like old memories, but like proof of who I used to be. Who I could be again. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my laptop researching everything I could find about Marcus's life outside our apartment. It turned out he'd been busy. Her name was Jessica, and she worked at his company in the marketing department. They'd been Instagram official for 3 months, which meant he'd been living a double life since February. My first instinct was to confront him immediately, to throw the receipt in his face and demand explanations. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memory of my grandmother's hands guiding mine, or maybe it was 4 years of feeling invisible finally crystallizing into clarity. I wanted more than just the satisfaction of catching him. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to have your foundation pulled out from under you. I started small. I called in sick to work and spent the day going through our shared accounts. Bank statements, credit card bills, insurance policies, everything we'd built together over 4 years. What I found made my stomach turn. He'd been moving money into a separate account I didn't know about, small amounts every month that wouldn't trigger alerts. Enough to pay for engagement rings and probably a deposit on a new apartment. My second discovery was harder to stomach. Jessica wasn't just his coworker. She was his manager Tom's daughter, which explained why I'd been introduced as an afterthought at that holiday party. Marcus hadn't just found a new girlfriend. He'd found a career advancement opportunity with benefits. The first part of my plan nearly backfired. I decided to show up at their office building during lunch, just to see them together and confirm what I already knew. I waited across the street at a coffee shop with windows facing their building, watching employees stream out for their lunch break. When I finally saw them exit together, Jessica's hand tucked into the crook of his arm like she belonged there, I felt sick enough that I had to leave my untouched sandwich and go home. But that night, Marcus came home and acted like nothing had changed. He asked about my day, complained about his workload, and fell asleep next to me like we were still the same couple we'd been a week ago. That's when I realized he wasn't just cheating. He was living two completely separate lives, and I was the one he designated as temporary. It took me 2 more weeks to put everything together. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence or making plans. It was acting normal while I watched Marcus continue his charade, making small talk about weekend plans while secretly scheduling apartment viewings with his future fiancée. I chose the setting carefully. Canard, the same restaurant where we'd celebrated our anniversary. I made a reservation for 3 people at 7 p.m. on a Friday night, then sent 2 separate text messages. I told Marcus I had a surprise for our relationship and asked him to meet me there. I told Jessica I was a freelance writer working on an article about successful young professionals and would love to interview her about her career trajectory. Marcus arrived first, looking confused, but willing to play along with whatever surprise I had planned. He'd even worn the same jacket he'd had on our anniversary night, which felt like the universe providing its own twisted sense of humor. When Jessica walked in 10 minutes later, I watched his face cycle through confusion, recognition, and panic in the space of about 3 seconds. I stood up and introduced myself to Jessica as Marcus's live-in girlfriend of 4 years, the one he'd apparently forgotten to mention during their engagement planning. Her face went white, then red, then white again. She looked at Marcus, then at me, then back at Marcus like she was waiting for someone to explain the joke. Marcus tried to salvage the situation by claiming I was confused, that we were just roommates, nothing serious. But Jessica wasn't stupid. She looked at the way we were sitting, the way I knew exactly how he liked his coffee, the way I casually mentioned details about his life that only someone close would know. When she asked him directly if we lived together, he couldn't lie anymore. The beautiful thing about public humiliation is how it forces people to show you who they really are. Marcus didn't try to apologize or explain or make things right. Instead, he got angry. He told Jessica that he'd been trying to figure out how to end things with me for months, that I was clingy and making it difficult for him to move on. He painted me as the obstacle to their happiness, like I was some kind of stalker instead of the woman who'd been paying half his rent and making his coffee every morning for 4 years. Jessica listened to all of this, then quietly took off the engagement ring and placed it on the table between us. She told Marcus she wasn't interested in being with someone who could lie that easily to multiple people simultaneously. Then she looked at me and apologized for not knowing I existed. After she left, Marcus and I sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, he said we needed to talk about how to handle the apartment situation. Not how sorry he was, not how he'd made a mistake, but logistics. Like I was a business problem he needed to solve efficiently. That's when I told him I'd already handled it. The next morning, Marcus discovered that I'd removed myself from every shared account we had, transferred my half of the security deposit back to my personal account, and notified the landlord that I'd be moving out at the end of the month. What I didn't tell him was that I'd also forwarded screenshots of our text conversations, bank statements, and a detailed timeline of his double life to his manager, Tom, along with a polite email explaining that I thought he should know his daughter had been unknowingly involved in his employee's deception. By Monday afternoon, Marcus had been called into HR for what the company termed a performance review related to personal conduct affecting workplace relationships. By Wednesday, he was looking for a new job. By Friday, he was asking if we could work things out because his career prospects had suddenly become very limited. I moved out that weekend, taking only what was mine and leaving behind everything we'd bought together. The new apartment I found was smaller, just a 1-bedroom in southeast Portland, but it had huge windows that let in morning light and space for a real work setup. I put my portfolio case on the dining table and left it there, open, like a promise to myself. 3 months later, I was freelancing full-time again. The bakery project I'd abandoned led to referrals, which led to more clients, which led to the kind of creative work I'd forgotten I was capable of. I designed logos for small businesses, websites for artists, promotional materials for nonprofits that were actually trying to make the world better. On a Tuesday evening in November, 6 months after I'd found that receipt, I was sitting in my apartment working on a brand identity project for a women's shelter. Rain was tapping against my windows, and I had jazz playing softly in the background, the same kind of music that had been playing at Canard that night. But now it felt like a soundtrack to possibility instead of an ending. Part 8 Reflective Takeaway. I used to think revenge meant making someone pay for what they'd done to you. But real revenge isn't about punishment. It's about refusing to let someone else's choices define your worth. Marcus thought he could keep me as a backup plan while he built his real life with someone else. The most satisfying part wasn't watching his career implode or his engagement fall apart. It was realizing that his opinion of me had never mattered as much as my opinion of myself. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never found that receipt, if I'd stayed in that apartment making coffee for two and pretending that being someone's placeholder was the same as being loved. Would I have eventually noticed the distance growing? Would I have figured out why his promises to spend more time together never quite materialized? But I think the receipt was just the messenger. The real message was something I'd been avoiding for months. I'd stopped believing I deserved more than what I was getting. And once you accept less than your worth, people will keep offering you less until there's nothing left to take. The woman who found that receipt isn't the same woman writing this story. She's stronger, more careful about who gets access to her time and energy, and a lot less willing to make herself smaller so someone else can feel bigger. She's also happier, though it took her a while to admit that being alone was better than being lonely in a relationship that had stopped being real a long time ago. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in any part of it, know that the moment you start believing you deserve better is the moment everything changes. Not immediately, not without effort, but inevitably. And that's a kind of revenge no one can take away from you.